I can't wait for this video because ranking anything is not controversial at all, right? Nobody's going to disagree with anybody's opinions. We are ranking all of the Nightlords in Elden Ring NIGHTREIGN from easiest to hardest. Now, to some degree, this list is going to depend on whether you are primarily playing solo or co-op, as I do think these bosses play very different in those environments, especially the last couple. Your experience with a boss greatly depends on the character you run, the build you're using, whether your teammates are competent or not, and have more than one brain cell. But basically, I'm going to try my best to rank all of these from easiest to hardest in my opinion, and give a little bit of an analysis on the boss and what makes them difficult or easy. I have put a ton of time into this game already. I've soloed all of the Nightlords, I've done most of them co-op, and I want to give my breakdown on what I believe to be the easiest and hardest, because I don't think it necessarily goes in order, and in fact, some of them are wildly out of place in my opinion. Coming in at the easiest boss, in my opinion, has to be Fathom of the Night. It's essentially this big fish that swims around, but what's more difficult about this boss compared to others is that it spawns in a lot of variables to you, right? You have these like jellyfish that will deal damage to you and eventually can put you to sleep. And the weird thing about both NIGHTREIGN and the base game of Elden Ring is that sleep is one of those status effects that very rarely actually comes into play or serves a significant factor. There are ways to deal with the sleep status effect, right? You can build up a resistance to it. Also, it's not the most devastating thing in the world. It's not like a big HP loss with blood loss or anything like that. It's not that difficult to handle, and especially if you have teammates who are ready to revive you in case you do die out of sleep, it's not too bad. Also, the other thing to mention is that Augur does appear in the world as like a mini boss occasionally, so you can get some really good practice against this. Now, it does have a very limited moveset compared to the full final Nightlord fight, but given that it's particularly vulnerable to lightning, this thing is very easy to shut down because it's not super aggressive. And as long as you or your teammates know the gimmick of, the things that it spawns in and the environmental hazards, the actual boss isn't too hard. I have legitimately never failed this boss. My first time playing it, I beat it, and it's one of the only fights I've never died on. I feel like anybody who's struggling beating this boss needs to probably have more teammates that are like centered around ranged attacks, like a Recluse or an Iron Eye or something along those lines, because if you have a couple of good ones on your team, there's no way you can lose. Coming up at number 7, if you had asked me where I put this one last week, I would have rated him much higher, but the more I play and experience fighting this boss, particularly in solo, the more I realize that this boss is all bark and no bite, at least in my opinion. I was really having a hard time with this boss in co-op. This was one of those ones that felt insurmountable, and as soon as I got sick of playing co-op and decided to do a solo run, I did it on my very first try. What I've realized about Adel, Baron of the Night, is that this boss essentially is packed with crazy visuals. And don't get me wrong, Adel does have some extremely devastating attacks. I mean, you can get like 1 or 2 shot in this fight if you're not careful, but every move is extremely telegraphed, and they are also very exploitable at the same time. He does have this big like gaping jaw move that works as a grab attack, and if you roll through it, which by the way is extremely easy to do, it does a ton of stance damage to him, leading to a lot of critical hits throughout this fight. Not to mention, he is particularly weak to poison, which can give you a few extra openings throughout the boss battle, and poison weapons are somewhat niche, granted, I'll give you that, but you can at least put a weapon with poison in your offhand or something and try to proc that throughout the fight as it goes on and get a little bit of extra damage. And if you're really optimizing, you can proc poison at the right time and kind of get extra damage for phase 2, which, speaking of, phase 2 definitely is more tough, I'll give you that. That's where most people die, but it's really just the fact that you have to just respect certain moves, and if you do and you kind of play with the same fundamentals, like, it's not that different of a fight from phase 1. You just have a few extra hitboxes to dodge on the ground when he spawns lightning. You need to get away from him every now and again when he does this big AoE move, but other than that, he's very easy just to stay under him and just slowly but surely deal damage. I don't have really a hard time with this fight at all anymore, because once you understand what's dangerous and what isn't, then you don't really have a problem weaving in and out of that stuff. Coming in at number 6, this might be a controversial one, but I'm going to say Caligo, Miasma of the Night is not a very tough boss at all. Despite it being like basically the final one before the actual Nightlord, this one was a little bit, I don't want to say disappointing, but it's certainly an archetypal dragon fight. And what I mean by that is, well, most dragon fights in Souls games, they're very stationary, right? Like you have big windows to deal damage to them, and they usually have like giant health pools, but at the same time, they have a lot of extremely devastating moves that you have to respect, and this one is no different. I would say that Midir in Dark Souls 3 is actually a much harder fight than this one, which is surprising given that this boss is literally made for co-op, and I feel like it's easier to solo than Midir is. Now, that's given the fact that you know what the moves are. I feel like Caligo is kind of a one-and-done fight, just in the sense that you're probably going to fail your first time around being a new player who has no idea what this boss is capable of, because you got a couple of moves that like you can't really predict. There's one where he disappears, the entire arena goes foggy, and your only option is to get behind one of these stone pillars before he comes back. Otherwise, it's essentially a wipe attack. Like you're dead if you are not behind these pillars, and that can be difficult to deal with, but once it happens one time, you've learned it and you know what to do from there, and every single move has a deliberate response that once you learn it once, this one is really not too easy to beat. It's just kind of a marathon because his health pool is so big and it does take a while for it to kill him. I would say Caligo is not a hard boss at all. It's just honestly an exercise in patience. Okay, but coming up after that is, again, maybe a little controversial where I'm putting it, but I'm actually going to say Gladius, Beast of the Night, aka the first boss that everybody fights. Now, given that it's the first boss, you would expect it to probably be the easiest, if not just one of the easier ones, and maybe it is, perhaps it's not, but I would put it probably like middle of the road, especially for co-op and people who haven't really played much of the game before. And even in solo, like, it's pretty easy to shut this fight down once you've learned it a couple of times. But really, if you have a holy weapon, I mean, it does kind of feel like a joke. But if you don't, this fight, I think, can be kind of overwhelming feeling. Mostly just when the Cerberus splits into 3 different dogs. I feel like that's the most dangerous part of the fight. When it comes back to one, you can kind of get under the chain and under the sword and deal some serious damage. But Gladius, you know, isn't a hard fight when you learn it. It's similar to most of these. But I feel like overall, in terms of like what players struggle with, given that this is the first one, I do think that it definitely deserves to be looked at as one of the more difficult ones, because it is a roadblock for some people for sure. All right, coming in at number 4 is Gnoster, Wisdom of Night. In terms of amount of deaths out of all of the Nightlords, including the final boss, I am kind of embarrassed to admit that this is the one that I had the hardest time with by far. When it just comes to purely number of deaths, this is the one that took me out the most, even more so than the last boss. It also is worth mentioning that I was soloing this boss on the pre-patch, but still, it was a rather difficult one, and I think just mostly because it was such a different fight compared to everything else. Now, it is a duo fight, but also not really. Like, the actual main scorpion beetle that you fight will go invulnerable for a period of time, right? He'll like harden up into this rock, and typically the butterfly will start going more aggressive with magic. You can actually use this boss as a bit of a wall or a shield from the magic, which is a nice feature, but also at the same time, sometimes that's just not really an option. And also the butterfly is particularly far away, so that melee-based characters are going to have a hard time getting any serious damage in. It's vulnerable to fire, which if you can get to the butterfly and especially get a critical and proc fire, it will deal a little bit of damage over time, and that's where you want to be. Like, that's great. But I do think melee-based characters are going to struggle here. If you play like Recluse or Iron Eye, I actually think this might feel like one of the easier bosses for you, and maybe that's fair enough. What I really have a hard time with Gnoster is actually phase 2. There's this move where it goes back and forth, charging like 5 or 6 times. The butterfly sprays magic, and the beetle is essentially a tank. If you get ran over, you're dead, and even if you manage to avoid all that, and if you try to heal, these beams of light will typically take you out as well. It's just a lot of dangerous things going on in phase 2 that this is what was taking me out the most, and again, there's ways to deal with it, but not to say that it isn't challenging. Coming in at number 3, I'm going to give it to the big man himself, Mr. Dark Souls 3, Fulgore Champion of Night. I call him that because I feel like this plays identical to a Dark Souls 3 boss. Like, it's fundamentally designed that way. And just visually, it kind of looks like one too. But I would say this is also one of my favorite fights in the game. I think that the flow and the way it's designed is excellent, and it's a ton of fun. And it, of course, does have 2 phases. Phase 1 is not really too hard whatsoever. You just have to look out for the extra wind box on his sword after he swings it a little bit. A lot of people try to heal during this time, and that's probably the biggest trap when you're learning this boss. But his lightning vulnerability is very easy to exploit when he's charging up this move, leading to a lot of easy critical attacks. Phase 2 is also why I consider it a Dark Souls 3 boss, because it feels almost exactly like Udix Gundyr. This Night Abyss arm is certainly more chaotic and unpredictable, and there's some giant AoE moves that you absolutely do have to respect, but it's kind of another one of those things where you just sort of spam dodge, and you should be okay through most of that, and as long as you're looking out for that extra wind box move, then really he can't do anything too crazy to you. It's one of the more difficult fights, I think, from like a technical perspective, and if you don't have lightning, vulnerability exploits, then this one is going to feel much more challenging than it should. And I was able to do this one solo before the patch, but now that the patch has come out, it is far easier. So if this is the one that was giving you trouble, go ahead and try it again, especially with the lightning weapon, and you honestly shouldn't have that much difficulties getting through. All right, coming in at number 2 is everyone's favorite goat, Libra, Creature of Night. This one is tricky because, I think a lot of people get baited into making a deal with him. Typically, in the beginning of this fight, a lot of people will make a deal and get some kind of extra benefit, but because he is the equilibrious beast, he's also going to, have some strength given of his own that will honestly make the fight harder in the long run. So it's best to just really not make a deal with him at all. You don't want to risk any other variables coming into play for this one. I think you just want to play it straight on. And also, I think he's difficult because he has a move where he goes relatively invulnerable, and then these sigils will spawn around, and depending on your character, you may not have any options to deal with or break these, and then he will power up. It's more challenging to fight him. But more so than that, I think it's the madness that really trips people up in this fight. The orbs that he spawns in, or the sigils on the ground that release a giant madness burst, almost one-shot you, and I just think that there's a lot of mechanics, especially with like picking up the little gems to reduce your madness, that is not, easily understood by the player the first time around. There's just a lot going on, and a lot of traps that you're going to fall into most likely. He's also very easy to, proc other status effects on, but he is vulnerable to madness, but there's really not almost any madness weapons in the entire game. So realistically, for most people, you're not ever going to be able to exploit his vulnerable window because it's just not a very common thing. However, I will say this, at a certain point in the game, you're going to have the Equilibrious Beast as an in-world event, and if you start fighting him in the world, you'll get a lot of practice for the main one. Obviously, you won't get the phase 2 moveset, but the first phase you should be able to shut down pretty quickly if you play it enough in the regular world. And even though this is one of the harder bosses in my opinion, I think that it's very learnable, especially when you get to the point where you're finding him throughout Limveld. But finally, coming in at number 1 should be no surprise to anybody. It is Heolstor, the Nightlord himself. What's crazy is that if you guys didn't know, eventually they're going to be releasing enhanced versions of all of the bosses, presumably. And that means that all of these other bosses are going to have Phase 3. And I can't even imagine what Phase 3 on this Nightlord is going to look like. I had enough trouble just beating this one to begin with, let alone an entirely different phase with brand new moves. This fight is hard because I think it's like visually decepting. Also, his moves hit very hard and he's extremely active. It feels like pre-patch Radahn in a lot of ways. Now, the first phase, the Shape of Night, isn't too bad. Like, you'll notice that if you have a holy weapon in particular, you'll be dealing lots of damage. You might even be able to get a critical during this phase, and he doesn't swing too fast or too hard, but he does have a couple of moves that come out so fast, they're pretty hard to react to, and the tell is very subtle. It's this shoulder charge that has like almost no startup, and if you roll back, you're typically going to get hit. Even if you react in time, you need to kind of go forward or to the side. This one is, it's a move that I really find annoying and is hard to deal with build sometimes. But the more that I've tried this boss, I think what I'm realizing is that what's difficult about it is that it moves in a weird, unnatural way. Like, it's almost kind of like Dancer of the Boreal Valley in Dark Souls 3, and even in this game, where the moves are just very inhuman-like. The tempo is slightly off to where what your natural rhythm is, you're probably going to get hit by a lot of his stuff because everything is just slightly off. This boss forces you to play very defensive, and if your defense isn't immaculate, then you don't really have that many opportunities for offense either. This one is very hard, and clearly, you know, you're gonna have a different experience if you're playing this one co-op or solo, but I still think it's an insurmountable challenge whether you're playing it solo or with other people. Phase 2 with the Moonlight Greatsword can be intimidating, but again, it's not impossible. This isn't even the worst part of the fight. It's when he goes up in the air and is going to change elements and come back down, and mostly what's tricky about this is that almost the entire arena becomes a hazard zone, and you really have no other choice but to get really far back or time your dodge perfectly to, you know, move through the explosion. This one has been a run ender for me for so many reasons, and if you manage to survive all of this, he now has different moves and an elemental type that you now have to contend with too. There's no doubt about it, this fight is hard as hell, and it's obviously the final boss for a reason, and I think a lot of people are going to have trouble on this one. And you know what? I think this list is definitely subject to change once the enhanced versions of all of these bosses come out. All of these with a phase 3 could completely change how I feel about the rankings, but what I will say is that no matter what, I don't think any phase 3 boss is going to transcend the Nightlord himself. That's just not going to happen. His phase 3, I cannot even begin to imagine what that's going to be, but we'll find out soon enough, I'm sure. But anyways, guys, thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe. Let me know your rankings down below, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.